ask the question, okay, fine, Jesus supposedly rose from the dead. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We'll get into that. But if he did, then I know it's good, and it's a good story, and it's got symbol of hope for me. But what does it mean? What does it do for me practically? How does that even affect my life? So he's risen, now what? What do we do with this? Well, this is what we do. We're going to go through each of these accounts and look at how each of the followers of Christ reacted to his resurrection. And then therefore to see how you and I are supposed to react to his resurrection. And Mark, of course, many of you know this. Mark was the first gospel written, the first account of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. It's also the briefest. Mark uses an incredible economy of words. He would have made a great newspaper journalist. He's very, very to the point, exact. The book of Mark reads pacing like a good narrative script of a movie. And so what's important to do in any story Mark gives us is to pause and to try to get into the words that he uses. Because when somebody speaks in the book of Mark, it's incredibly important, but it's incredibly easy to miss. Now, we're going to talk about resurrection today. So here's what we're going to do. And some of you I know have been Christians for years, and some of you are still approaching this whole thing and asking, who is God? And, okay, who is Jesus? And what does he mean for his life? And all these bold claims that he made. Now, here's the boldest, of course, is that he rose from the dead. That's the boldest claim that he made. And later on, Paul writes in the Bible that if you don't believe that he rose from the dead, then all of this stuff that we're doing this morning is pretty worthless. I'm paraphrasing, of course. He says your faith is futile. If you don't believe in the resurrection, then what are you doing here? And so we're going to process this today for a little while to ask the intellectually honest question, did this resurrection actually happen according to Mark? Or is he just giving us a nice story this morning? Something that we can warm our hearts up to and say, it's a symbol of life over death. It's a symbol that gives us hope, and that's great. But here, what we have to do is approach the resurrection being very, very intellectually honest with it, and then asking the question, what now? What does this do for me? What does it do for you? You're going to go to lunch probably after service. You're going to go to work tomorrow. You're going to be interacting with your friends. What does this resurrection even mean? Here's what it means. Let me give the story first, the context. Okay. We have three women in the story, Mary Magdalene, Mary, and Salome. And they approach this tomb. The tomb is supposed to be the tomb of Jesus. And it's the third day after he was crucified, as we all know. So he was killed. They put him in a tomb. They put a very, very, very large rock in front of it that nobody could really move. And these three women are coming to the tomb. Now, why? Well, they're coming to the tomb with oils, they says, to anoint this body, because if you can figure this out, a dead body sitting in a tomb for 3 days smells kind of funky. So they want to fix this. They want to clean up the body and perfume it. Okay. They get there, and the stone's moved. Okay. So they peek inside, and then there's this young man. You can call him an angel. He's dressed in white. We'll assume he's an angel. They call him a young man. He's sitting there, and he has a dialogue with them. Now, what this angel, I'm going to call him an angel, says is vitally important for you and me to understand the significance of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. First, and here's what we're going to do. Because you know that here at Soul Grace, I throw this term around, being intellectually honest. I say it, and this is what I mean by it. Many of you have been to my house, of course, and many of you have eaten my food. Thank you for doing that. It's a pleasure to cook for you anytime you want. Now, you come to my house, and I put something in front of you. Most of the time, it's recognizable. Most of the time, you know what you're eating, right? I assume you do. If you haven't been to my house, you will. It's just a matter of time. I'll get you there and cook for you. But if you come to my house one time and I put out something in front of you and I decided to get really tricky, go fancy on you and make something that you've never seen before from some exotic country you've never heard of, no lasagna. We're talking something green and kind of jello-like-ish substance, and I put it in front of you. Are you going to eat it? I hope you would, to not offend my sensitivities. But I would really question your intellectual capabilities if you just dug in and started eating that thing without asking me the most important question. What's in this? What is this? And ask it nicely. Now, if you ever come over, please ask nicely. Like, oh, Pastor, what's in this? Now, if you trusted me as your pastor, you know that you could eat what I put in front of you, but I would greatly question your intellectual capacity if you did so. I want you to ask, what's in this? And I want to do that today again. What's in this resurrection? Before we just throw it down our throats and swallow it whole, we have to doubt our doubts, doubt our beliefs even. And let's ask this question. For a couple minutes here, ask the question, is Mark really trying to capture an historical account of a man rising from the dead, or is he just giving us a story and it could have never really happened this way? You have to ask it. What's in this? Here's what it is. First, let's be really honest with ourselves today. Historically speaking, I'm going to break it down in a few ways. I'm going to break it down first, historically speaking. At the time, the decades before Jesus and the decades after him, there were dozens of messianic movements. There were all these guys who were standing up in crowds and saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the king you've been waiting for, come follow me. And almost all of them got followers. Some of them got quite a few followers. But historically speaking, we know that what's interesting about them is that when those followers died, when the leaders died, the movement died. In Acts chapter 5, we even have Gamaliel, this famous rabbi, standing up, and he quotes two people who you probably never heard about, and he says, Theudas was one guy, and Judas the Galilean, and he says, guys, don't you remember these guys, Theudas and Judas the Galilean? They stood up, and they said they were the Messiah, and then when they died, all their followers left. Now, if Mark is not talking about an actual resurrection, and if the resurrection didn't happen, then you have to come up with an equally plausible and reasonable answer as to why this movement of Jesus, not only did it not die after he died, but it grew and it prospered. See, every other movement, every other Messiah, they die, the movement dies. This is the only one where the leader dies and the movement lives and grows, exponentially so. So if you're asking the question first, if you're saying this resurrection could have never happened, then you have to come up with a reason, understanding why this movement prospered. And the church says it prospered because Jesus actually rose, unlike all those other leaders who died and rotted in the tomb. Jesus himself actually rose, the church says. That's the reason why this movement, as opposed to all those others, flourished instead of dissipated. Okay, well, if you don't buy that one, okay. If you're not buying that, and I know a lot of you are very intellectual, you're very smart and learned people, so I'm not going to insult your intellectual sensibilities this morning. Let's carry this further, okay. Not only historically speaking is it absurd to say the resurrection couldn't have happened. Factually speaking, that's not what Mark's trying to communicate. Do you know what Mark does here? If you look back at Mark 16, or if you have your Bibles open, you can go back to Mark 15. He repeats the name of three women, Mary, and Salome. Now, what is he doing here? What Mark is doing is what we know all ancient historians did. He's saying, listen, here's a factual account of something that happened, and if you want to go verify it, I'll give you three witnesses. You see this? He writes down the names of the people, not to just because he was trying to be creative. He writes down these names of the women because they're still alive at the time, probably that he's writing, and he's here to say, listen, if you want to verify this story, go talk to them. They saw him. Now, as an ancient historian, you would have never put down people's names if you were just telling some symbolic tale. No, Mark's not doing that at all. He's saying this is historically relevant, and this is factually correct, and if you want to prove it, go talk to the women. But you know what's even more absurd? Let's give a picture. Mark is sitting around writing this book, okay? Imagine you're Mark. And you say, I need to create a religion because the world's gotten too out of hand. I want a set of moral codes that people can follow, and that if they read the Bible and if they pray on this, that they'll be good moral people. I need to make this up. Okay, let's find some people to verify this resurrection. He would have never, ever in a million years put the name of three women. Women at the time were second-class citizens. Women in some provinces couldn't even testify in a court of law. Do you realize how absurd this would have been for Mark to have made this story up? He would have said, listen, the resurrection happened, and if you want to go prove it, go talk to these three women. Oh yeah, and by the way, they're women. They're not noblemen that you can trust. They're women. If Mark was truly writing a story of hope for us, a symbolic story of hope, rather than a real story of a resurrected body, he would have never done it this way. Okay, so hopefully I'm starting to win some of you over a little bit, even if you've been a diehard Christian for many, many years, and you've never really challenged the idea of the resurrection. Historically, you can see it in light of all the other movement. Factually, you can see it in light of the fact that Mark would have never written it this way, had it not been fact. Lastly, and this is the one that I love when modern people bring up. Modern educated people love to say, well, the resurrection, it didn't really happen, and people in that age, they believed it because they believed those sorts of things. They were uneducated. They were uncivilized. They believed in miracles and hocus pocus stuff and all that. But today we're learned, right? Aren't we all? We have educations and degrees. We know empirically speaking that resurrections just don't happen. And you say, well, listen, they were uncivilized people and they were more prone to believing that. Before you do that, you have to understand that they were not prone to believe that a man like Jesus would physically rise from the dead. The prevailing Jewish thought at the time, the prevailing Jewish sentiment, there's actually a quote from a scholar, Brichtoth, that I put in your outline, I believe. He writes about how the early Israelite concept of resurrection is that it's some sort of a unified, your family in death is getting together, you're unified with your family and your tribe, and then all at the end time, you all will rise again. And they say, yes, there were individual resurrections in the Old Testament. But by and large, the Jewish prevailing sentiment was not that a single man, let alone one who called himself the Son of God, would rise from the dead, physically speaking. They just didn't. It wasn't in their worldview. They said resurrection can happen, but that's later on, not like this. Well, the Romans at the time, they had a more of a Greek philosophical understanding, which too, it did believe in resurrection, but not this type. See, at the time, the Greek philosophy would have said, and you can look at, the best example of this is Achilles. He supposedly rose from the dead, and he became an immortal deity, but you couldn't touch him. They didn't have scars like Jesus did when he rose from the dead. They didn't eat fish with you like Jesus did when he rose from the dead, and we'll see that in a couple weeks. See, listen. If you want to write it off as modern people and say, listen, we know empirically, scientifically speaking, resurrections cannot happen. And the people at that time, of course, they believed it because they were uncivilized and it was part of their worldview. Absolutely not. And here's the proof. Do you notice, if you read the book of Mark, Jesus repeats that he's going to die and on the third day he'll rise from the dead. He says it over and over. He says, guys, I'm going to die. 3 days, I'll rise. 3 days, I'll rise. 3 days, I'll rise. 3 days, I'll rise. It's the third day. And no one is around the tomb waiting for this to happen. The disciples, where are they? If they're sitting around in a room, surely they would have said, listen, wait a second. He died on Friday. Okay, Saturday, it's the third day. Let's go check out the tomb. It can't hurt. Let's go look at it. And of course they don't say this. Nobody's around. Why? Because they didn't even expect it to happen this way. Even the women who are going to the tomb, they're not expecting to see a resurrected Jesus. They're expected to see the dead Jesus. And this is why the angel, this is what's so important. The angel says two things. And I went through that long speech to say this. The angel looks at them and says, he is risen. Like he said he was going to. He's not here. And this offers an extreme challenge for our heads today. Because whether you've been at church for many, many years, or whether you're new to this whole church thing, and whether you've heard Easter sermons about the resurrection, or whether you don't know if it really existed, or whether you're staunchly against the idea that it could have happened, and you think, well, that's a good story, but it didn't really, really happen that way, Mark won't let you get away with that. He says, here it is in historical context. Here it is with factual eyewitnesses. And here, look, not even they expected it to happen this way. It's an extreme challenge for our intellect, I know, this morning to do that. To question whether this resurrection happened, and it did. And Mark says, listen, I'm not here telling you some story to give you some hope and good feelings and warm fuzzies in your heart. He says, I'm here to tell you the facts that a human being named Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. Now, you can dismiss that, or you can accept it, but you cannot do anything in the middle. You either call Mark a crazy man and throw his book away, or you say, yes, it happened exactly as he said it. He won't let you get away with anything less. But here's the fun part. That's the challenge for your head this morning. Now I'm going to give you a challenge to your heart. And it comes with the second thing that the angel says to the women. Look at your Bibles again. If you look at verse 7. And the angel says, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, what's the significance of this? The angel looks at them and says, go and tell the disciples and Peter. If you were, you're going to think I'm an incredibly weird kid growing up. You probably already do from all my stories about being a kid. Here's another one. Do you ever play this game? If you're not from the United States, you're probably just going to think I'm a weirdo right now. It's called Mad Libs. Come on, somebody shake their heads. Yeah, okay, so we got some people who know Mad Libs. Mad Libs it's a game that you play as kids. It's basically a booklet. And there's stories in it, but the stories omit certain words. And you're supposed to ask your friend, say, give me an adjective. They give you an adjective like fuzzy, and you write down fuzzy. And then you say, give me a verb, and they write down fishing. Or they say fishing, and you write down fishing. And then they say, give me a color. You say, give me a color, and they say green, and you write it down. And then you read the story, and it's all about like a fuzzy fisherman fishing in a green lake or something. See, the words that they use are interchangeable, and then you pass it around, and you do that again. And you can... I can't believe a pastor is going to say this, but you can play Mad Libs with the Bible a little bit. Hold on. Because what you can do as an exercise, if you want to know what the meaning of the thing the person said is, ask yourself, what if I replaced it with something else? See, the angel says, go and tell the disciples and Peter. You know what the angel could have said? You know what the angel should have said? He should have said, go and tell those lying, cowardly, backstabbing fools that Jesus is going to come. Oh, and when he gets there, if they grovel enough, and if they beg enough, and if they say they're sorry enough, maybe, just maybe, he won't smack them around. And maybe, just maybe, he'll forgive them. See, that's not what the angel says at all. The challenge for your heart this morning, the challenge of the resurrection and the challenge of Easter is this. The angel says, go tell those guys, the disciples, who abandoned Christ when he needed them the most, that he's coming for them and he already forgives them. This is grace. The angel had every right to say, Jesus is coming back, and those idiots, those liars, those fools who turned on him, they're going to get what they deserve, because you know what? That's what you and I would have said. But the angel speaks grace when he says, go tell the disciples, and you know what's even better? You notice how, and I missed this for so many years, he says, go tell the disciples and Peter. See, imagine you're the disciples and you're sitting around the room and Mary comes in and she's out of breath and she says, okay, I saw it. He's risen. He says, go to Galilee. All the disciples, they're pumped, right? They get up and they go to Galilee. You're Peter. And you say, go ahead. You say, I know what I've done. I did far worse than any of you could have. And there's not a chance in the world that Jesus wants to see me. Because you know what Peter did to him? Peter did the worst to him out of all the disciples. They abandoned him. He utterly abandoned Jesus. He lied about even knowing him, and he did it 3 times when he was supposed to be the closest one to Jesus. And you know, this is why the angel says, go tell the disciples and Peter. Because he's included in this grace. You know what this means for us? It means that no matter what you've done, actually, if you've done the worst things in your life, you're closer to seeing the amount of grace that God has shown you. It's the worst sinners who get the greatest grace and understand the greatest power of redemption, and they're moved the best. And this is probably why Peter ends up becoming the leader of the church and the strongest of Christians. Why? Because he knows the depths of grace that he needs. He says, go tell the disciples and Peter, that loser, that jerk who turned on me when I needed him the most, you go tell him I love him. And I'm going to be with him. The resurrection is this. It's proof that you and me, no matter how great of a debt we've had in our lives, no matter how much wrong we've done, we get a stamp put across our lives that says that debt is paid. Peter, you don't deserve it, but you get it. You did everything to turn away from me, Jesus would have said, but I'm coming to meet you. I've already forgiven you. No groveling, no fear, no worry. Paid in full. It means that fundamentally, I'm going to make it very practical for you. If you and I this morning do say, okay, Mark is talking about a real resurrection, it really did happen, and it's proof that Jesus cares about me, and that he extends grace to me, and that he saves me. You know what that does? That challenge to your heart starts to challenge every fear and worry that you and I have. It starts to say, what do you fear in life? Do you fear failure? Do you fear rejection? I'm sure Peter did. And Jesus says, no more. What I love about this is George Herbert puts this the best in his poem, Dialogue and Anthem. He's got this great dialogue. It's a dialogue. It's a death and the Christian are talking back and forth. And you want to ask, what does this resurrection thing do to me as a Christian? Here's what it does. He looks at death, and the Christian says, alas, poor death. Where's thy glory? Where's thy famous force, thy ancient sting? And death looks at the Christian, says, alas, poor mortal, void of story. Go spell and read how I've killed thy king. The Christian looks back, almost smiling, saying, poor death, and who was hurt thereby? Thy curse being laid on him makes thee accursed. Death looks at him and says, let losers talk, yet thou shalt die. These arms shall crush thee. Christian answers, spare not, do thy worst. I shall be one day better than before, thou so much worse, that thou shalt be no more. The Christian sees this. A resurrected Jesus means you and I can look even into death's eyes, can look into failure's eyes and say, do thy worst. You shall make me more beautiful than before. See, the resurrection of Jesus, apart from all other faith stances, says this world matters. You matter. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, God is not an absentee landlord looking down on us. He came, he knows our condition, and he says, I've redeemed it, and I'm starting to fix it. Martin Luther was asked a question one time. I didn't put it in your outline. He says, somebody came up to him and said, this is great, Martin Luther, said, what would you do if Jesus was coming back today? What would you do? And you know what he said? He said, I'd plant a tree. I'd plant a tree. Why? Do thy worst, I shall be more beautiful than before. The resurrection says, plant a tree. Wouldn't it be more beautiful when Jesus came? Because that's what the resurrection says. This world matters. This is important. Grace says you are now included in the greatest narrative of all time. What shall you fear? Do thy worst. Just to conclude with this, I wish this could be a whole sermon unto itself, and I wish I could unpack this more. There's actually a couple words for fear that are used if you look in your translations, in the Greek at least. You don't have a Greek Bible, I don't think, but if you look back in your English translations or whatever, you can read. It says that they were afraid. The women were afraid when they saw the angel, or affrighted in the old King James Version. And it says when they left the tomb, they were afraid. But those are two very different words. And I want to make this very practical for us today, the resurrection. The first word that says, when they saw the angel, the better way to translate that word in Greek would be to say they were outawed, literally. They were in such awe that it was like a fear to them. And of course, that's probably the reaction if you and I see an angel. We'll be in awe. But when they left the tomb, it says that they told nothing to anybody around them because they were afraid. And this word afraid in Greek means to be afraid of punishment of some sort for a wrongdoing. See, I know, I get real with you guys. You all go to work, you go to school, you do your jobs, you raise your children. You have the same, you and I have the same fear. When we see an angel, it's awe. When we have to go out into the world and talk about the resurrection, it's fear. Why? Because at its core, the resurrection sounds silly. It sounds stupid, and these women knew that. That's why these women were afraid. Surely they knew. If they went around telling a story of a poor, homeless Judean man who predicted that he would destroy a temple, save the world, free everybody, all the captives, and he got killed on a cross, and they went around and saying, that guy is now walking around and he's physically alive, they would have been laughed at. And worse than that, in the early church at this time, people, if they had said that story, which they did in the book of Acts, they would have gotten stones thrown at them. They would have gotten thrown into prison. Now, you and I this morning, thankfully, do not face that same trouble. If we talk about the resurrection out on the street this morning, I don't think anybody's going to throw a stone at us, although they might if they don't like us that much. These women had fear, and rightfully so. But you know what the early church fathers did, and women? When they went around preaching about Jesus, they didn't go to the slaves and the oppressed people and say, listen, I have a great story of symbolic hope and faith that if you only accept it will make your life appreciably feel better. No. They went around and said, he's risen. I've seen him. I know it. And because I know it, everything in my life has changed. Everything is happy, and all things are being made new. I have no more fear. These people went around, and they didn't fear. They didn't say, here's a message of hope. They said, listen, this is a true story. He's risen. Now what? Now what? Spare not. Do thy worst. The resurrection proves for you and me that by grace we are granted in to the narrative of all narratives that says this world matters and it's getting fixed, and there'll come a day when it'll be ultimately fixed, and he is risen. Now go out and go and love and serve and never have any fear. Take some time now in prayer, in silence here. Think about this. If you've heard this before, make it new to your heart. And if you're not really sure about it, this is your chance, in silence, with your Lord, to go before him and say, what does this resurrection mean? He is risen, now what? Please pray.